Few musical masterpieces have ever premiered under such difficult circumstances as Gustav Mahler's Second Symphony. Ticket sales were nil. He had to use his own funds to finance the concert. And to fill the hall, free tickets were given to students and musicians. There were also unusual rehearsal problems. Mahler was the conductor in Hamburg, but the concert was in Berlin. The director wouldn't let Mahler out of any performances, so he had to conduct the opera, drive his car at midnight to Berlin, rehearse the next morning for 3 hours, and then come back and conduct an opera and do the whole thing again the next day. Then there was the problem of being stricken with a massive migraine headache just at the time the performance was about to begin. But he dragged himself to the podium and forced himself to conduct. And what happened next is a transcendent moment in music, where not just music to the people in the hall, but true creation took place. The critics, as usual, attacked Mahler, but today, audiences are swept up by the joy, the tragedy, the sheer life of Mahler's tale. It's a mammoth work, 5 movements. It's long, 1.5 hours, a huge orchestra, more than 100 musicians, and a large chorus with 2 soloists. The story about creating the Resurrection Symphony, as it's now called, is one of the most fascinating in the history of music. It took 6 years, and it was in piecemeal fashion. The first movement, called Totenfeier, Rites of the Dead. Mahler says it takes place at a funeral, where the mourners there confront with searching questions. Why did you live? Why did you struggle? Is life nothing but a huge, frightful joke? Mahler said that anyone into whose life these questions come must one day answer them. He gives his answer in the last movement. But it would take 5 years before Mahler returned to the symphony. Why? First, a program problem. Remember, the first movement's about a funeral. How do you follow that story? Normally, a funeral is the end of the story. Then there's the possibility of Mahler's response to a cruel rejection by the famous conductor Hans von Bülow. He sought Bülow out because he wanted to convince him that Totenfeier was great, but Bülow listened and then said, "It's terrible," basically. He said, "If that's music, I have never heard any music." Mahler was devastated. But after 5 years, he tried again, and he came to the second movement. But being unable to compose something new, he recycled something old, a theme he had written 5 years earlier. A charming Mozart-like dance movement emerged from this. The dance music, though, continues the story, but how can it when the first music is a funeral? It's a tough act to follow. So Mahler used the flashback. The second movement is a nostalgic moment, he said, recalling shared happiness with the deceased. Then he tried to compose the third, but once again he blocked. So he turned to songs, the only music he ever composed other than symphonies. One song, called St. Anthony's Sermon to the Fish, is a cynical tale about a priest, St. Anthony, who goes to the church and finds it empty, and goes down to the sea and gives a sermon to the fish. Well, the fish listen, and they go back swimming afterwards, apparently to sin. Now, the ink was hardly dry when Mahler found the solution for the third movement, the silly fish song. Immediately converted the song into the third movement. This time, though, Mahler said, the music depicted a distorted world which you return to after you awaken from that dreamy second movement, and then life seems meaningless. You cry out in a scream of anguish. This is a movement which comes very close to expression, musically, depression. He tried the third movement, no ideas, so he turned to more songs. Urlicht, Primal Light, was another song he wrote about innocent faith. It never occurred to him when he wrote the song that it would ever be in a symphony. It was just meant to be a song. Suddenly, he made the song the fourth movement, a true invention. Mahler was the first composer to take an entire song and make it into a symphonic movement. The song concludes with unwavering faith. Dear God will light my way to eternal life. Mahler starts on the finale, but again blocks, so he stops composing for 6 months until the death and funeral of Hans von Bülow, the conductor who told him Totenfeier was worthless. Now, if Bülow's remarks undermined Mahler's confidence, his death unleashed the creative process. During the funeral service, the boys' choir sings the Resurrection Chorale, and Mahler senses the solution. He said, "It flashed on me like lightning, the flash that all creative artists wait for." Resurrection would be the answer to the questions of life and death Mahler raised in the first movement. he raced home to start composition. Now, Mahler's program for this last movement is an eerie one. It is a picture of the end of the world. Mahler says the last judgment is at hand. But Mahler's version of the Day of Judgment is that there is no judgment, no punishment, only overwhelming love. A chorus of saints invites all to heaven singing, Auferstehen, ja Auferstehen, arise, yes arise. So it was there that Mahler, migraine and all, at last unveiled his creation. Hearing the music for the first time, Mahler reported, "The whole thing," he said, "sounds as though it came to us from some other world, and I think no one can escape its power. It's a conclusion with which I'm sure you will agree, as we now listen to the thunder of the cello and basses as the first movement of this remarkable symphony begins to unfold."